Hi, this is Tom, and I'm going to talk to you about the three parts that make up exposure. Now, one thing we need to understand is that I'm assuming a correct exposure. So, what does that mean? It means that your camera will take a light reading based on the light you have at hand. It is possible to get an incorrect exposure, but for this, let's assume we're trying to make correct exposures. Okay, so what are the parts of exposure? Well, exposure is made up of three things: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. So we're going to start with ISO. Now, what exactly is ISO? For film photography, it was a lot easier. You would get yourself a roll of film. This, for example, is a roll of Ilford HP5 Plus. It's 400 speed film, but you could change it, right? 400, 800, 1600, but the whole roll would be like that. 36 exposures, same ISO. Now, digital allows us to make one picture at one ISO, change your ISO, and you can make another picture at a different ISO. Here are some common ISOs. You'll notice that they have and double, right? So we're just starting at 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. These are whole ISOs. If your camera is set to third stops, you will have two stops in between 200 and 400. Don't necessarily worry about that. It's easier to explain this process with whole stops. Now, what this means is the lower the number, the less sensitive your sensor is. So you would use 100 in bright sunlight. If it was dark out or you were inside, you would use an ISO of 1600 or 3200 when you do not have as much light. Then it would be more sensitive. Now, that's the first step. That determines how sensitive the sensor is. The next part is aperture. And aperture determines how much light goes through the lens. And the way it does that is with lens openings. Now, for example, some lenses start at f4, right? And you can see this is not necessarily to scale, but it is a large opening. It's letting a lot of light in. Conversely, like 5.6 gets a little smaller. 8 gets a little smaller. 11 gets a little smaller. 16 gets even smaller. 22 gets even smaller, and 32 gets even smaller than that. So what that means is that lens opening is letting less light in the higher the number. So if it's bright outside and you are at ISO 100, you're probably going to be using an aperture of, say, f8 or above, depending on your shutter speed. What do I mean by shutter speed? Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open, and it's usually based on fractions of a second. I just start here at 1 second, but then it goes like half, quarter, 8. It doesn't go 16th, it goes 15th, right? And then it goes 30, 60, 125th, 250th, 500th, 1,000th, 2,000th, 4,000th of a second, okay? That goes from slowest to briefest. Now, all of this depends on how much light you have, okay? So if it's bright outside, you're at ISO 100 and you're at f8, right? You're probably gonna be somewhere around 250, 500th of a second, somewhere in there, just sort of assuming, right? If you then walk inside and none of the lights are on in your house, you're immediately probably going to need to go to 1600 at f4 and probably around 60th of a second. That's just like a guess. If you've got window light coming in or something, it's just relatively dark. For example, in the classroom, it's about 1600 at 60th of a second at f4. If that gives you sort of like an idea. It's never as bright as you think it is. Okay? The thing you have to remember is all three of these work together. In manual mode, you will set your ISO and you will set an aperture, and then you'll take a reading, and then you'll have to adjust either your aperture and your shutter speed together to get a correct exposure, right? If you used aperture priority, you would set the ISO and you would set the aperture, and the camera would pick the shutter speed. If you use shutter priority, you would pick the ISO, you would pick the shutter speed, and the camera would pick the aperture. All right? The thing to remember is that ISO determines sensor sensitivity, aperture determines how much light is traveling through the lens, and shutter speed determines how long that sensitive sensor is exposed to the amount of light that traveled through the lens. Step 1 in learning how exposure works. If you ever have any questions, feel free to reach out and I'm happy to help. Thanks a lot.